I wonder if he's still out walking the dog.
All right, we are live on YouTube, and I will begin letting people in. Good evening, everyone. This is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're just getting started, just opened the doors. So we'll take a couple of minutes and let people come in. Welcome. Good evening. If you've just arrived, we're just getting started. On Zoom, it takes a few minutes to get people in the door. So if you're looking for the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall, you found the right place. Just give us a few minutes to get going. And we are live on YouTube as well. And recording. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just letting people in. Welcome. We'll get started in just a moment. Letting people in. As we hit a magic number at my discretion, whatever that is, then we'll get started. We'll give it one more minute and then we'll get going. All right, 3, 2, 1. Let's get going. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Matt Losak. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. A couple pieces of information before I introduce everybody. If you have questions or concerns, please put them in the chat. The raise hand function is not really good for us. We don't have a big enough crowd for that. So please put questions and concerns in the chat, and we will get to them best we can throughout the discussion this evening. We have with us tonight the Vice Chair of the Renters Alliance Board of Directors, Chris Perry. We have my staff member, David Mullins, who will be monitoring the chat and has been busy in the field working with tenants for the last several weeks, but especially today even. And of course, we have with us the Deputy Director of the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, Frank Desmarais, who's covering for a number of county staff today. It was such a beautiful day. Only the managers had to work. So Frank, welcome and thanks for coming. A couple of things about tonight as my phone rings. A couple of things about tonight. We're going to discuss yesterday's hearing at the Environment and Transportation Committee in Annapolis. We had a tremendous showing of witnesses speaking in favor of just cause eviction law. Our delegate, Janelle Wilkins, who is also on the board of directors for the Montgomery County Renters Alliance, has proposed over several years just cause eviction protection. And it has taken a number of forms. In an earlier version, it was a protection for everyone in the state of Maryland. Then it was protection that if passed, it would have been only for Montgomery County and just Montgomery County enabling, meaning that the legislature would authorize Montgomery County to pass it if Montgomery County so chose. Then it was Montgomery County only. So if the legislature passed it, then Montgomery County would not have to enact it. It would be enacted for Montgomery County. All of those were blocked in the Environment and Transportation Committee. This year, the strategy, which seems to be working, was to propose just cause eviction enabling legislation for all jurisdictions throughout the state of Maryland. And that seemed to have hit a nerve because, in a good way, because just about every jurisdiction in the state of Maryland, certainly the major jurisdictions, expressed their support for that empowerment. Now, what is just cause eviction law? A lot of renters don't realize that when you move into an apartment and you make it your home, that a landlord still has the power in Maryland, not in other places like Washington, D.C. or New York or some places in California and Seattle and many places actually. But with just 60 days notice at the end of your lease, the landlord can say, we're not going to renew the lease. And so no matter how long you've been in your apartment, no matter how good a tenant you are, a landlord does not have to provide a reason. The landlord can simply say, we're not going to renew the lease. So what are your options? Well, you could say that's not fair. But if they gave you proper notice and you stay one day longer than that 60 days at the end of your lease, you're what's known as tenant holding over. And then the landlord can file in court against you to evict you for tenant holding over. And unfortunately, because the landlord does not have to provide a reason, a justification for not renewing your lease, there's very little defense. In fact, there's just about no defense against the landlord, except to say, I didn't get the proper notice. But if you got 60 days notice, that's all the judge is going to ask for. There's also no access to discovery. That is the right to demand evidence in a tenant holding over case. So if you believe that you're being retaliated against and having your lease not renewed and being evicted from your home for tenant holding over, but you believe that you're being retaliated against because you complained about the rats in the basement or poor maintenance or abusive behavior, like a landlord coming into your home without proper notice, or excessive rent increases, or perhaps organizing a tenants association so that the tenant community in your apartment community can collectively work to improve conditions in your building. Any of those reasons which are against the law. But if the landlord doesn't have to state why, it's impossible to prove that that is the motivation. Now, there are some justifications for evicting somebody that a tenant holding over protection or just cause protection would include, like if the landlord were going to take the apartment off the market permanently, or the landlord was going to move in a relative into the apartment upstairs for a small landlord, for example, or a large landlord or a small landlord was going to engage in extensive renovations or demolition of an apartment community that would make the apartments uninhabitable. That would be a just cause. And of course, all the other reasons for anybody to be evicted are just causes. If you don't pay your rent, eventually you will be evicted. And if you don't abide by the rules in a serious way, and you commit what's known as a substantial breach of the lease, you could also be evicted. And just cause eviction protection would not protect you from that. But it would require that the landlord, if they said they're not going to renew the lease, they have to provide one of those reasons not to do so. Because the Renters Alliance and our allies across the state, and some of the people who testified yesterday, which included, by the way, County Executive Mark Elrich, County Council Member Will Jawando, and by the way, all of the council supported this. Those that I didn't testify were also in support of just cause, as it was the county executive, as was the vast majority of the Montgomery County state legislative delegation. So we've had tremendous support in Montgomery County, but also we got support from council members from Prince George's County, the council president from Baltimore City, council members from Howard County. We got support from all of the gubernatorial, Democratic at least, gubernatorial candidates have stated their support for Just Cause. And yesterday, gubernatorial candidate Tom Perez spoke for it, and gubernatorial candidate John King spoke for it. And then of course, the Renters Alliance board chair Will Roberts spoke in favor of it, as did the Public Justice Center, Jews United for Justice, Legal Aid, and on and on. And of course, many, many renters, including my colleague and the vice chair of our board, Chris Perry. Chris, do you want to mention what your position was on this and why you came to supporting this, aside from the fact that we would have to expel you from the board if you didn't?
Well, I've lived in this apartment with my wife for 12 years, and really all the landlord would have to do for whatever reason is to simply non-renew the lease, and we'd have 60 days to to find a new place to live. And that's jolting and upsetting to just about anybody, but particularly people who've who retired like we have and are living on a fixed income. Our lives tend to be oriented around things which are fixed and stable and predictable. And when if the landlord decides suddenly to force us out, we're in a mad scramble to get our belongings together and find a new place to live. It's not healthy for a lot of people, particularly people who've been, who are 60, 70, 80, 90 years old and who've lived in the same place for a long period of time. This legislation, among others, is meant to protect them. And so that's what we tried to get across yesterday during the ENT hearing. I think we were successful, but some of the same arguments that have been brought against just cause eviction were brought up again by the landlord industry yesterday.
And they are beautiful arguments that have been rather consistent over the years. One is,
exactly,
if you regulate us, we're going to take our marbles and leave town. In other words, right, they're not going to invest anymore in building any more apartment buildings, and they may move their businesses elsewhere. The problem with that argument, as we have seen, is that in places where just cause eviction protection exists, right, rent stabilization exists, and a whole panoply of renter protections has been in place for decades, we see no such evidence of that. The fact is that Montgomery County and the whole Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, like New York, like Houston, like Miami, like San Francisco, like Seattle, are high demand regions. And I know Frank Desmarais would agree with me that we have high demand for apartments in these areas, and that makes the rental housing industry a very profitable and valuable industry. We have relatively low vacancy rates. So where there's money to be made, we're going to see business trying to make it. The other argument that they make is that they can't get rid of nuisance tenants. Well, I don't know what that means. And frankly, in our belief from the Renters Alliance standpoint and from Renters United Maryland, our statewide coalition that we co-founded with the Public Justice Center, Jews United for Justice, and Communities United, which also has about 30 members, law firms, civics associations, and so on. But our position is that there needs to be a serious standard before you remove somebody from their home, and that anybody out there who's had to deal with the varied competence and integrity of property managers that come and go, most of us would not like to be subject to the arbitrary decisions of these kinds of people, but should have a standard that says this is a good enough reason to remove somebody from their home, not just a hair going up on the back of your neck, or because you came in and argued about your rent increase, or because of the more nefarious reasons, which they don't have to state, such as the color of your skin or your religion, or organizing a tenants association, or pursuing promised or required services in your building, which we have seen. Other bad news that needs to go along with this is that we are seeing a near doubling of tenant holding over filings in the state of Maryland as a process to evict tenants. And the reason that we're seeing this is that some landlords, some of the less responsible landlords, are seeking to do this as a way to circumvent first the eviction protection orders that were provided by the Centers for Disease Control and by the governor's office. The other was because many renters remain unstable, are still behind in their rent and struggling to get rent relief, that the landlords are hedging their bets and saying, you know what, I don't want to tie my hands, so I'm going to put you on a month-to-month lease, and if your rent doesn't come in, I'm going to sue you for tenant holding over in 60 days. And the courts may be willing to suspend or at least delay an eviction for failure to pay rent if you're pursuing the rent relief, but there is no defense in the tenant holding over process. So it becomes a way to circumvent all the measures that county and state and federal government have put in place to stabilize housing during the pandemic and to help out tenants who have been mostly working class and lower income tenants who have been so devastatingly impacted financially and socially by the pandemic. So, this has been a major discussion yesterday. I will put the link up from YouTube that shows the hearing. If you get our newsletter, you can also click into that and watch that hearing. Another piece of legislation that came up yesterday that we thought was very important, that another one of our board members, also a state delegate, Vaughn Stewart, put forward is a House Bill 674. The other bill, by the way, was House Bill 881. This is House Bill 674, which would allow the courts, if you've applied for rent relief, to suspend or delay an eviction process pending the rent relief decision being made by the local jurisdiction's government. So if you've applied for rent relief with Montgomery County and this law were to have been enacted, you could go to the judge and say, I have applied in good faith to Montgomery County, and they're still working on my application. Here's proof that I applied, and they're still working on it. And please give us more time so that we can reconcile the court process with the COVID rent relief program. It seems obvious that that ought to happen anyway, but it hasn't. And so the courts in many cases have gone forward with evicting people who were waiting for rent relief and were eligible for rent relief, but the relief didn't come in time to prevent the eviction, which is a terrible tragedy that upsets us very much here, especially. So that's another piece of legislation. Renters United Maryland, which is again the coalition that the Renters Alliance co-founded, has a site called rentersunitedmaryland.org. And if you go to that site and look in the top right corner, you could see what our legislative priorities are for the 2022 session and catch up on that. And if you have any other questions about legislation, there's a lot out there. One of the things we can pat ourselves on the back on is in 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when we started this process, there were very few pieces of legislation that considered renter protections. And over the years, that has grown. Last year, we had 20 pieces of legislation before the Maryland General Assembly. Only a small number of them passed, but the fact that we had that kind of discussion taking place across the Maryland General Assembly, that it got a lot of attention, and there was a tremendous amount of disappointment that many of these bills did not pass, but there were also commitments to begin looking at these bills immediately during this session. So if you're paying attention to what's going on in the state legislature, you'll notice that there is a wide and varied discussion on different types of renter protections. So we've made progress in the awareness, progress in the understanding of the needs of tenants, and with any luck, we'll make progress in the passage of legislation that ultimately, from the Renters Alliance standpoint, has very obvious objectives: stable, quality, affordable rental housing so that people can live as long as they want to, if they pay their rent and abide by the rules in their apartment homes. We do not view rental housing living as a temporary station on the way to something else. We don't view apartments as hotels or Airbnbs or dormitories, but as people's homes. And we know that when people are stable, it has value financially, socially, politically in our community. So that's why we're engaged in all of this. But we're also engaged in helping renters understand their rights, understand their responsibilities, and understand what resources are available to them, and helping to guide renters to those resources. So if there are any questions in there for us now, David, anything?
We've got a couple about rent relief that I think is coming up. And then I just got back on one legislative one. So I think we're good for now.
Okay, then in that case, let me turn it to the Deputy Director of our Housing Department, Frank Demaray, who's got a long list of pieces of information that we need to hear, from COVID rent relief to what's going on with Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, code enforcement, and is also available to answer your questions. By the way, we have a very lean and mean discussion this evening, and there's no need to go all the way to 8:30 if we don't have to, but we'll get through all this and see where we end up. Frank?
Okay. Yep. Thank you very much, and good evening. As we, Matt was just saying, I'm going to be here discussing or describing a range of county resources and support. I'm going to cover a number of topics. The chat function and the Q&A function on the Zoom. As you put things in, David will be monitoring, but I'll be trying to answer them as well. So the fundamentals of what we're focused on is keeping people in their houses and avoiding people becoming homeless or forced movements where we can. The COVID rent relief program, if you've heard about this, it was offered in 3 different phases, beginning in middle of 2020 through the end of 2021. The phase 3 applications received by the end of December, some of those are still in process. Almost everyone who has submitted an application has heard back that their application has been assigned to case management and is working through the process. If you submitted an application and did not receive back any confirmation at this point, there is an email address that's available to inquire, and it's available to those that also have heard back but are unsure of their status. The email address to send inquiries is the letter HSS, actually stands for Housing Stabilization Services, HSS at montgomerycountymd.gov. You can email that and ask about status of an application. Applications were discontinued after December 31st with a announcement and a commitment that there were additional federal funds that have been allocated to the county, and the county is also going to be receiving some federal funds that were allocated to the state and then reallocated to the county. We're in process of resetting the eligibility and the income and other documentation. We're trying to, in the next round, keep it as simple as possible to learn from some of the processing challenges we've experienced over the first 18 months. But the process will be very similar. The commitment is that additional funding, the county has received directly about 34 million, and the state has allocated us a minimum of an additional 6 or 7 million, so about 40 million of federal funds. The 2021 total was 59 million. So it's a fairly substantial amount that will be available in 2022. And that will begin, right now the commitment is early 2022. It's not going to be announced in the next 2 weeks. They're working very hard with the state requirements to determine exactly what we can put as eligibility, but that will be announced in the near future. In the meantime, and I put into the chat, there is a site on the county's website. It's part of the Department of Housing Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS. And that website has a place where you can register interest and ask for updates when available. So you can put in your name, your email address, it'll go in the system. And when the information is available, it will be communicated to you. It will not count as an application. Don't wait for people to get back to you for the rest of your application. So if you register your interest there, it will simply be a way for you to share your email address, that when information about the next round of COVID rent relief is available, you can get information about that. Matt was talking about the degree of need. The county is acutely aware that we lost many tens of thousands of jobs, that they were very specific to certain communities and certain industries. We know that we have very significant income loss, and that many households who are currently maintaining their housing have been doing so by wiping out savings. And we know that there's a lot of what we call housing insecurity, but people are extremely anxious. So the COVID rent relief will be part of the support and solution. We know it won't be available or be eligible for everyone. And so when that becomes available, there will be demand. We hope that the amount that we have will satisfy a significant portion of the outstanding eligible, but we know there will be a lot of households that will not be something that works for them. The other support that the county provides at this time, it's not shut down, but is if anyone receives a formal final notice, sometimes it's called the red and white notice. When the sheriff's department receives a eviction order, or a writ of restitution, a writ for eviction, they will come to the property, they will post it on the door. There'll be a mailing of that information. If any household receives that, they should immediately call the county, and that is for our Housing Stabilization Services funding, to determine eligibility. You can call 311. Everything I'm going to talk about tonight, you don't have to remember all the different email addresses, et cetera. You can call 311, which is also 240-777-0311, but inside the county, you should be able to dial just 311 and get connected to the call center, which, and when you explain that you are received an eviction notice or that you need housing stabilization services, they will take your information. They'll share some basic information with you. They'll create a service request, and that will be prioritized with that Department of Health and Human Services, which has funding that can help a household in some cases paying up past due to avoid the eviction enforcement. In some cases, it'll help with relocation and help with first month's rent or security deposit. But it is not the large amounts of past due rent. The large program, the COVID rent relief program, which through December offered up to $12,000 for past due rent and some forward rent. We don't have the final numbers for the new round, new phase coming up. It will be a substantial amount available for past due rents. But if you're facing any urgent, immediate risk of being evicted, it's very important to contact the county and determine whether you're eligible and what would be available to you to help you either avoid the loss of your housing or to help you not become homeless and to relocate. So the
Frank?
county's, go ahead, sir.
Frank, let me reiterate some of the things and break apart some of those things so that people understand. There's a couple of buckets here. What Mr. Desmarais is talking about is the COVID rent relief program, which is the one program ended December 31st. There's another one that's about to open that has between $30 and $36 million possibly available. We're not sure how much that is. We're not sure what the eligibility is for that, though we think it'll be similar to the previous program. And we're not sure, Frank, I'm not sure if you said what the level will be of support for past rent, whether that will be 12,000 or we're just not sure yet.
We're not sure yet.
We're not sure yet, but there will be some money available. So that's one program for those who've been impacted by COVID. That's one program. There's another program that the Health and Human Services Department has, the Services to End and Prevent Homelessness, that has certain amounts of money to help people who are going to be evicted, because you don't qualify for that program. You're not going to get enough money from that program because of any other reason that you think that eviction is imminent. And Health and Human Services has some funds available to help put your belongings in storage, to help you find alternative housing on an emergency basis. And I believe, Frank, there might be some money at the Department of Housing and Community Affairs as well for an emergency like this.
Say for emergency, I'm sorry, say again.
For a hotel or something like that, is there any funding through the Department of Housing and Community Affairs in addition to Health and Human Services?
Not for avoiding eviction. So there are some support funds through Emergency Action Coalition, some other community-based organizations that have some funds to help when there's an identified need. The Department of Health and Human Services, our Housing Stabilization Services team, will reach out to the community-based organizations and any other resources to help put together a package of assistance if they can identify that. So the fundamentals Matt just covered very well, which is that there's the bigger long-term rent arrearage program that will be coming. And then there's the immediate support if you are facing imminent eviction, to reach out, and the county will try and pull together its own resources, state resources, community-based resources to try and address that.
And the Renters Alliance is here to help guide you there as well. It's confusing. It's confusing for us, but we've been doing it for a long time. So first thing I would suggest is what Mr. Desmarais is suggesting: contact 311, ask for Housing Stabilization Services, and get that help. If it gets confusing, if you get information that you don't understand, if you find difficulty in that process, email us at info@rentersalliance.org. We'll reach out to you and guide you to give you advice on what we know is available, and then possibly guide you to the resource that you need. But one thing that we would like to emphasize is please don't wait. Contact us as soon as you are seeing these kinds of threats coming to you. The earlier, the better. But if you get a red and white on your door, that's from the sheriff's office. That means your eviction is imminent. And the sheriff's office is moving faster and faster these days as the pandemic wears off. Today, I believe, Frank, the mask mandate is no longer in place. That's a signal that the pandemic is, for now anyway, weakening. And as the pandemic weakens, government operations improve and become speedier, and that means the sheriff's office.
Yeah, the other things I just want to point to, because again, we know money is the critical missing ingredient. The state does have some programs. The county's websites has information about on utilities to avoid utility shutoffs. So there's a focus, as we move forward with additional programs, we're looking to coordinate as much as we can utility payment assistance for those that are behind on utilities and facing loss of habitability by losing their gas or electric or water service in some individual properties. So again, the county 311. I want to touch on the challenges and the support for those that are not getting the rent relief, either because they're not eligible, the program's not open at this point, and are struggling behind on their rent and trying to maintain. The recommendation is to work with your landlord to the best that you can, communicate with them, to respond and not to avoid contact with the landlord. When the rent relief program becomes available, it will require that the landlord participate We do have options in those programs where the landlord fails to cooperate and participate, but generally the landlord will provide the data on the past due amounts of the rent. So having your landlord know that you intend to apply for that, that you will be in contact to get the information needed to apply for it, and maintaining open communication and working as you can with anything the landlord will offer in terms of repayment plans or just other options to maintain your current place until you can catch up the rent. Renters Alliance and other organizations are available. The county has engaged, worked with, and supporting the CASA organization, the Housing Initiative Partnership Organization, and Latino Economic Development Corporation. These are all listed at the county's website that we have for renters, which is montgomerycountymd.gov / that's the slash that goes to the right, / renters, just the word renters after the main county website. And you will see a list of those organizations, their contact information. You'll also see a list of all of the resources available through the county and information about your rights. It was mentioned that a red and white notice, a sheriff notice, is the imminent eviction. Landlords can communicate with you demands for you to pay and demands for you to leave your home. You cannot be removed from your home without the sheriff being present. So if you have a landlord that is attempting to self-evict you or to evict you without assistance from the county, from the courts, from the sheriff's department, that you should call 311 or call the police and report that you're being denied your house, your home. It cannot be done without the sheriff's office. So it's important to know the difference between the different communications you'll be receiving.
Frank, let me just go over that again. It's so important that the tenants understand that process. As Frank Desmarais just said, no landlord can evict you themselves. The way this starts, we know that many tenants receive all types of threatening communications from landlords. It could be from the landlord, him or herself, saying, we want you out in 10 days. It could be from the landlord's attorney saying, we want you to put your keys on the desk in the office on 20 days from now, at the end of the month or whatever. Those notices may be legal in the sense that they must give you those notices, but they do not have the force of law in that they cannot be used to evict you. The actual eviction process follows first hopefully a proper notification from the landlord saying, hey, you're behind in your rent or whatever the reason is. We want you to leave or we want you to rectify the situation. Then, as we understand it now, there's a law in place that we helped put in place that requires the landlord to post a 10-day notice on your door that comes from the courts. The 10-day notice it's a very scary notice. It's unfortunate, it's confusing, and it's threatened a lot of people. But here's what it is. It just says this is a 10-day notice of summary ejectment. That sounds like eviction. That just means it's a 10-day notice that the landlord intends in 10 days to file with the court to create a court summons for you to go to court for eviction for whatever the reason, usually for failure to pay rent. So you'll get that 10-day notice. Then the landlord files in court, and then you will receive a summons to go to court from the court. It's usually a yellow and pink document that they'll put on your door. And then we urge you, of course, to go to court and also to contact us. Let us know that this is coming. If you've applied for rent relief, make sure Health and Human Services knows that you've received this document and that your eviction is now processing to a more imminent stage. And you can do that by, again, emailing Health and Human Services COVID Rent Relief Program and hss@montgomerycountymd.gov. It was in the chat. We'll put it in there again. So then you go to court. And then if you haven't resolved the situation, that is, you haven't paid your rent, you may have what's called a judgment against you. That is, the judge will say, you haven't paid your rent. I'm standing with the landlord and making a judgment against you. The landlord will then file what's known as a writ of restitution. It's just a quick form that says, yes, I want to schedule the eviction. Then the court will send that to the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department will then come to your door and put what we call a red and white. It's a very clear and dangerous looking note that says, this is from the sheriff and we are going to evict you. Here are some information about who you can call, what you can do, but we're going to come, and if you don't remove your belongings in shortly, we will stand with the property manager or the landlord and have them remove your belongings from the home, change the locks, your belongings will be put on the street. So that is the eviction process. In
And Matt,
between
if I
that
could-
process, though, as Frank Desmarais just pointed out, no one can come into your home and change the locks. They cannot turn off your water or your electricity. They cannot come into your home and harass you and demand rent or put threatening or publicly facing threatening messages on your door or anything like that. There's some messages they can put on your door, but if it's harassing, let us know and we'll guide you as to what's appropriate and what's not.
Hey, Matt.
David, you had a comment?
Well, I think there was a question that would just, if you could just take it a little farther, the thing you laid out, there's a question about after that eviction notice, the red and white, are they going to actually kind of show up for the eviction? And I think you hinted at earlier that we don't, it sounds like it's an uncertain amount of time, but that was a question that was raised.
Certain amount of time for when the eviction is going to happen?
Yeah, like when between when the sheriff gives that notice and when they're actually going to come and do the eviction.
The problem is we don't know. Frank, you can weigh in on this, but we've seen anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 weeks. Is that about right?
That's correct, which is not to pause and to assume that it could happen and to prepare yourself. So you should be contacting the county for any financial assistance. You should be counting Renters Alliance or some of these other support organizations to understand what you have received and what your options are. But the focus is absolutely at that stage to have support in planning for what happens, when, not if, but when the sheriff will come and forcibly remove everything from the home. And that does happen, and it's happening to a dozen or so households a month.
Right.
And
One other thing I want to point out is that if you pay the rent, even on the day that the sheriff arrives, you can avoid that eviction. So, getting the county's rent check together, if you're going to get one, they need to know so they can process a check. There are other resources out there, but if you pay down what you owe or come up with a deal with the landlord, which is unlikely but possible, the eviction can be avoided up to the day that the sheriff arrives. However, if you've had 3 judgments against you in a 12-month period, the landlord could say, I don't care if you pay off the rent, I'm still going to evict you. So 3 judgments against in a 12-month period, the landlord has a right to foreclose any possibility of redemption. That is, you're redeeming your apartment. So keep that in mind. That's rare, but it does happen as well. Frank, what else?
I want to highlight a few of the protections that are currently available so folks understand them. There's a set of county laws, our landlord tenant laws, which provide requirements for certain notices and processes. We talked a little bit here on the court processes. Matt noted one thing that started in October that is still new to most people, that by state law, any landlord that before they file with the courts has to give you a 10-day notice that they intend to file. And they can give you that notice on the 2nd of the month. If your lease says the rent is due the 1st, they can give you a notice. It's a very scary notice. It indicates that they intend to eject you from the property. It's actually a required wording by the state, and on the backside of it, it talks about all the legal resources available to help you. But it's a notice that if they don't give that, they cannot file in court. And so you do have protections if they don't follow the procedures, give you that notice. The notice does include the legal assistance organizations providing free legal assistance in the county. At the county's website, the montgomerycountymd.gov/renters. I've put that link in there, but just, /renters at the end of the county website. It lists the legal assistance organizations that are free. If you get any notices from the court that they have filed a case filed against you, you get a hearing date. It's very important to take that serious. It's very important to seek advice and free legal advice. And so the phone numbers, the information, how to connect with those resources is at the county's website. It's on the backside of that notice that has to be given to you before they file any court action. So you can work with those organizations. Failure to pay rent, or if you spoken to earlier, if you get a notice that your lease is expiring and you're being asked to leave with 60 days notice and you don't leave, and they file a tenant holding over or breach of lease case, any legal filing against you, the county is supporting, and the resources are available, excuse me, for free. Please take advantage, not just take advantage, please take it serious and find out all of your rights.
So somebody in the chat has a question about what is a notice to vacate. And so there are different kinds, but obviously what it is it's a notice. One notice can come from your landlord. I want you to leave. All right, it's a notice to vacate. One could be more legally required, such as a notice to vacate, which is 60 days before the end of your lease. That's required in order to, again, sue you for tenant holding over if you stay beyond the 60 days. But basically, any kind of notice from the landlord or the landlord's lawyer or legal representative that asks you to vacate or to leave your apartment is a notice to vacate. I believe what Frank Desmarais is talking about also is that 10-day notice of ejectment, which is required by the court now, that if the landlord wants to move more seriously to evict you, they have to give you that 10-day notice that says notice of intent of summary ejectment. It's scary looking, but it's a court form that says in 10 days, we're going to file with the court. And that filing then will produce a summons to come to court from the court. So that's notice to vacate.
And we're doing a lot of this verbally here. We'll continue to put in the chat links. I'm adding another one for the Landlord Tenant Handbook. It has a number of pages that describe a lot of this. It's available in 7 languages. So the link I put in there, you can follow that and you can look at it online. You can download it. You can share it. You can share it with your landlord. You can, as you learn or as you have questions about it, you contact the county, call 311 for landlord tenant affairs, and we'll help explain your specific circumstance and how your rights are protected. Another issue that you'll hear about is the current and reasonably soon expiring maximum rent increase. So the county, except in the city of Tacoma Park, does not have long-term rent stabilization or rent control. The county has an emergency rent increase limit. It was passed in April of 2020, and it was due to expire in November of 2021. The county council extended that till May 15, 2022. So 3 months from now, any notice of a rent increase for the next 3 months until May 15, any notice of a rent increase cannot increase your rent more than a fixed percentage. That percentage is based on an annual number. The number was published February 4th this year, and the number, which is an average of rent increases in the Washington metro area, was 0.4%. So for any rent increase between February 4 and May 15 notice, any rent increase notice cannot tell you that your rent is increasing by more than that 0.4%. Prior to February 4, the prior year cap was 1.4%. So if you got a rent increase notice in February 1 or January 1 or December, and that rent increase has not occurred yet, that was limited to 1.4%. If you receive a rent increase notice on March 1, saying that your rent is going to increase in 90 days, it cannot increase your rent by more than that percentage. And the rent increase notice actually has to spell that out. It has to state, this is your current rent, this is your new rent, this is the percentage increase, and this is the number the county publishes, which is actually called the Voluntary Rent Guideline, sometimes using the letters VRG. But the Voluntary Rent Guideline had been entirely voluntary before the April 2020 COVID Emergency Rent Relief Act. It will become voluntary after May 15, 2022. So for 2 years, it will have been established as the rent increase cap. So just again, if you receive a rent increase notice before the middle of May, May 15, the rent increase cannot be more than 0.4%. After that, it could be any number. And the headline news on rents is that in many communities, rents are going up by substantial percentages, 5%, 10% or more. So that there is protection, but it's for a period of time. Anybody that receives a notice that they think is incorrect or illegal or not allowed, again, should register a complaint. And one of the things I want to point out is, calling and leaving a message is not an effective complaint. We do have a phone number and we do have email for the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs and phone numbers, but the best way to get attention and to log it in and to ensure that it's followed up on is to call 311 and say that you'd like to make a complaint on Landlord Tenant Affairs, or to go online and at our website, there's links to the complaint form online, or if you just search Montgomery County Landlord Tenant Affairs complaint, you're likely to get redirected by Google or another browser. So register a complaint and the county will follow up and investigate and determine if the rent increase was not correct.
And you can also contact us and request information if you can't find that. The complaint form is also on the Renters Alliance website. But Frank, if I may, I'd like to go through again about what these renewal notices have to include, what a renewal lease looks like now. A law we passed in 2016 that was put forward by County Executive Mark Elrich, who was a council member at the time, called the Renter Protection Act of 1915, Bill 1915, included a provision that said that renewal notices had to be 90 days prospective. So when you get a renewal notice to renew your lease, it has to be 90 days ahead of the renewal. So if your lease is due May 31st, count 3 months before, and that's when at least you're supposed to get that renewal notice. So if you've got a renewal notice that's only 60 days in advance of the end of your lease, it's what Frank was alluding to as being defective or illegal and are not having the force of law. The renewal notices also have to include other elements. One, as Frank pointed out right now, it cannot have an increase of more than 0.4% if it was a renewal notice issued after February 4th. If it was issued before February 4th, up to April 24th of last year, Frank, correct me if my dates are wrong, I believe April 24th of last year, then it was at 1.4% increase. No more than that was permitted because of the emergency rent cap. So it had to say, this is what your rent is, this is what your increase is, this is the percentage of your increase, and it also has to include language that says if you have a problem with what we're telling you, if you think the rent is excessive or any of these things, here's how you contact the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs to make a complaint. I'm not sure I have all of the elements, but those elements have to be included in your renewal notice. And if they are not, then your renewal notice is defective. And we have seen in some cases where a renewal notice is issued and therefore the increase doesn't count. And when we call people on it, then they have to reissue the renewal notice, and they have to credit forward any increase that you paid up until the time when they legally reissue the renewal notice, which is 90 days prospective. So we ask you to make sure you look at your renewal notices. If you think that you've got a renewal notice that doesn't include those legally required elements, let us know, because one of the concerns the Renters Alliance has is that it's not just you. If that's the renewal notice you got, then everybody in your community is probably getting a similarly formatted renewal notice that needs to be updated with those elements and be 90 days prospective. So please let us know. Frank. You're on mute.
Everything Matt just said, again, complicated, but it is in the Landlord Tenant Handbook. I actually noted that it's on page 21. I put the link in there earlier. There's another element of the law that was passed in November, which extended that rent increase cap. That is a requirement that any landlord charging that has not received the money already, may have put it on the rent ledger, but has not received late fees. Any collection of late fees up through May 15, the landlord must provide a notice to the tenant that they're attempting to collect late fees from. And that notice must tell the tenant that they are eligible for a waiver of late fees if they state that they have had an income impact or loss due to COVID, and their income is below the income thresholds that are printed on the back of the form. And these are the same income limit or eligibility that we were using for the COVID rent relief at the time. So if you have lost income and your current income based on your household size is at or below the level on the back of the form, and you can state that you have lost income, you do not have to provide any supporting documents. You do not have to prove to your landlord what your income is. You do not have to prove to your landlord that you lost income due to COVID. But if you sign a form that says that, and you're making that as a sworn statement by yourself and your household, then the landlord has to waive any late fees they were attempting to collect from you. So if you believe that you have late fees on your account and that you can state that you have had income loss due to COVID and that your income is below the threshold numbers, the form and the details, again, are available at the county's website, the /renters website. So if you go to montgomerycountymd.gov, that /renters, and you look for the fee waiver information, or if you just search, Google search, or put in the search box at the county's website, late fee waiver, it will direct you to the information and then to the form. If you complete that form, you don't have to wait for the landlord to give it to you. If you believe you have late fees that are being charged to your account and you're eligible for waiver up through May 15, so for the next 3 months, you can deliver that form to the landlord, and the landlord is obligated to waive those late fees. They're still going to be trying to collect past due rent, but they have to waive those late fees. So this is a very important additional support for the households that were impacted by COVID. We absolutely understand that landlords have lost an enormous amount of lost rent. There are a lot of properties that are struggling to pay their bills. They've got mortgages, they've got maintenance, their costs have escalated. Inflation has absolutely been very harmful to the ability to manage and maintain your buildings. But the county council determined that the late fees were an extra expense that were appropriate for those impacted low and lower income households impacted by COVID, that they would require landlords to waive those. So I just want to point that out. Yep.
Can I pause you for a question?
Yeah, I was going to say, go ahead, Dave. I see a few in the chat.
I think there's two here. There's a couple from before that we'll get to in a minute. I'm seeing y'all's questions, but a couple that are just on point right now, just for clarification. One is the percentage increase limit. we need clarification on if the date that matters is the 90-day, the date of issue prior, or the date that the first new rental payment would be made. And then we have, what if the landlord never provided the late fee form? And I mean, I guess maybe that's a question of kind of where that goes if you claim that never happened and what the county would do then.
Okay,
Frank, you want to, what I know about one of them is what exactly Rosie would have told me to say, which is that if you have a complaint that you've submitted a late fee form and the landlord is not acknowledging receipt of that late fee form, then you should file a complaint with the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, and they will help you resolve that.
and I would reinforce on that doing that before May 15, even if someone denies they received it, you can still file it again. You can figure out, address of that. If the landlord collected fees from you after you filed the form, that means you would have paid those fees, and how you paid them, that can be documented. And so that's another component, but it does need investigation and documentation that can be supporting the statements as much as available. On the dates, on the timeline, it's very tricky, and I'll give just example that if you have a lease that's coming up for renewal on the 1st of May, and you get an increase notice, that's 90 days before the increase can go into effect. It cannot go into effect till August 1, and it's going to be restricted to that 0.4%. If you have a lease that is renewed on May 16th or June 1st, and 90 days notice, the first day that you can have an increased rent would be 90 days after that, or likely September 1 on a June 1st notice. So, the absolute amount of rent increase cannot exceed whatever the guideline was at the time the notice was given. So this protects against rent increases greater than the prior 1.4 or the current 0.4 all the way through the middle of August. But that notice on June 1, effective September 1st, would be without restriction. And so you will have 90 days notice that your rent is going to that new level. You have no recourse on that. Either you agree to the lease and begin paying that on September 1, or you have 90 days to find another more affordable property.
It's also important, I want to point out that any renewal notice that you're given now, because of a law the Renters Alliance passed way back when with County Executive Elrich and others, that you are to be offered a 2-year lease as well. And if you accept the 2-year lease in that renewal offer, the second year also cannot be above 0.4%. So if you get that offer and you intend to be a long-term tenant, take advantage of this 0.4. As Deputy Director Demaray is pointing out, there's a lot of pressure to raise rents now, and we have no guarantee that this stabilized effort will last beyond May 15th.
Okay, and then speaking of notices, if I can just shift to a notice that we talked about earlier, the 10-day notice that comes before any court process is started. We had a question: should I contact legal assistance group when I receive that 10-day notice, or wait for a court hearing to be scheduled? And I can comment quickly. I mean, we wouldn't advise you one way or another, I don't think. But what I'm here, because you can always reach out generally, to an attorney for a consultation. But from as far as my understanding is that the 10-day, I mean, I would wait probably if it were me, because like Frank mentioned earlier, I wanted to reiterate, as soon as you're 1 day late on rent, you can get that 10-day notice. And we were 1 day late where I am, and we got that notice even before our rent was technically late. We had until the 5th, and it came before that. So, we just paid it, and then nothing happened, even before. So often that's certainly before. You don't need to reach out to the county or the attorney if you're able to pay it soon after that.
Well, they messed with the wrong guy. But if let me just say also that there are different reasons to receive that notification. If you feel that you're being retaliated against, through an eviction process, reach out to us. We can certainly, we're not lawyers, but we can give you preliminary sort of the first aid level before we send you to the doctor. We've got a lot of experience in dealing with this, and we can help you decipher whether this is something as simple as David points out of, hey, look, you were late, which you're late one day after the first of the month, technically, and they may have a system of giving you that notice immediately, which is ridiculous, but they might do it that way. And we might say, hey, pay the rent and it's done. Make sure that the landlord knows, make sure that they end the process against you. On the other hand, if it looks like this is the beginning of a long process that's going to lead to court, we might guide you to legal services depending on the circumstances. So it really depends.
And then Matt, you mentioned retaliation. We had a question about that. If you want to expand, someone was kind of asking, are there laws on the books, state and county, that if an eviction based on retaliation, do we have that? It is not allowed. Do we have that now, or is that something we need to lobby for at the state level?
We do, but I'll let the Deputy Director of Housing address that first.
Well, the fundamental is that a landlord cannot harass and cannot retaliate against a tenant on the basis of the tenant exercising their rights. In all multifamily buildings, there is a required poster, tenants' rights poster, which reiterates this, and that the county's legal position in our law is that tenants cannot be retaliated against. That can be a defense in a tenant holding over filing if it's considered to be retaliation. It is a defense you have to prove. And so there's evidence required, there's information to be required. But before going to court or dealing with that, calling the county, registering a complaint that there is action being taken. And it's a interpretation. Many people understand words and actions and information that's provided, et cetera, in different ways. So it'll be an interpretation of what constitutes an actual aggressive action or retaliatory action. But we do have legal protections.
I did see a question about how we could be effective in lobbying for more renter protections. Let me say the Renters Alliance is very much engaged in this, but it's only a small fraction of our work. We would love to have a team of lobbyists the way the landlords do with the Apartment and Office Buildings Association, the Maryland Multi-Housing Association, the Bankers Association, the Realtors Association, all together constitute a multi-million-dollar lobbying operation. So let's start there. So if anybody has $1 million to donate to us, we will immediately create the Renters Alliance lobbying or legislative lobbying outfit. Short of that, what we've done is mostly with developing partnerships and coalitions locally and statewide by organizations that have a little bit of interest, a lot of interest in this, or are completely involved in it like we are. Actually, we're the only ones who are completely involved in it, but some of them care about this more than others because they have constituencies that live in rental housing. I believe our statistic that we're using is that I remember when we started this back in 2007, DHCA's number for the number of renters living in rental housing was about 23%. Now we're about 36+% renter in the county, and I believe that reflects a statewide statistic as well. So we're marching towards a larger population living in rental housing, which means larger influence provided people are aware of what rights they have, what rights they don't have, and how to exercise their political clout in Annapolis and in local government. So we're working on that, but we are definitely the mouse against the dragon here. And so we hope all of you will participate with your vote, with your testimony, and by keeping us informed of the issues going on in your communities and being informed about what the candidates stand for and what they don't stand for. What else, David?
We had two people ask the same question about a 2-year lease, which is that only apply if you're leasing at market rent, or people who have a reduced rate, are they entitled to be offered a 2-year lease at that rate as well?
Frank?
The 2-year lease requirement is irrespective of whether or not the unit is being offered with income-based rent. One of the things that comes up with income-based rent is that some of the leases will require that you recertify your income eligibility annually. And leases, in many of these properties with subsidies do not, cannot maintain above income tenants. And as your income goes up, you may be not eligible to occupy those units, but the lease can be offered with that condition.
Right, so the justification, if the landlord can justify not offering a 2-year lease, then they don't have to do it. And as Frank points out, if they have to annually certify you, it is the position of the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs that they only have to offer a 1-year lease. By the way, the Renters Alliance disagrees with that, but we don't have the resources to file a major suit on that issue so far. But that is the position of the county.
And we had a question about related to inspections of apartments. I think in the pest control context. So their question was kind of, can they come in and look through cabinets and things? But then I think also asking, then how far does that go into bedrooms, bedroom closets, and things? And that, I think that's where they were going with that question.
We've dealt with this before, and I believe the rule of thumb is that those things that are owned by the apartment community, such as the cabinets, the refrigerator, the closets, can be inspected. If you have private boxes, like your dresser that you own, a lockbox that you own, any kind of furniture that belongs to you is private. But there may be good reasons for a landlord or property manager to look in the cabinets to check for cockroaches or vermin or damage or water damage. The same thing in your closets. If you have things that are private in those spaces that are owned by the landlord and you don't want them to look at them, then you should be given proper notice that they're coming. And during that notice time, you should remove them to a place that is private. They can't go into your computer. They can't look at your checkbook. They can't go into your personal file cabinet. They can't do a search like it was a police search, but they can look at the material belongings of the apartment community. So just keep that in mind. And if you've got things, if it's dirty in there, they have a right to know, because if your refrigerator, your cabinet space is dirty in a way that could increase the possibility of vermin or cockroaches that could then also contaminate the neighboring apartments and community spaces. So that's generally the rule of thumb from what we know before. Frank, is that wrong, or you have anything else?
That is correct. And it does touch on another topic, which is that any questions on code compliance, that's specifically a landlord-tenant issue of rights, but it does touch on, and we do get questions regularly on how to deal with when you do have infestation issues or difficulty with property management landlord responding to and managing health and safety issues, including infestation. We've talked about the 311 for tenants' rights. The same service system, if you have issues, concerns, a complaint, specifically health and safety, the advice is always to work with your landlord, work with them to remedy. But if you get to the point where it is not being remedied and it is in violation of the requirements, or what you believe to be the requirements of the county, to file a complaint. Like we were saying, just make sure you get it recorded. It can be done by 311, can be done online, and a code inspector will follow up to talk with you about your complaint, to connect with the landlord, determine what's going on, and try as quickly as possible to get the issue identified and get a solution going. So the county is performing in-property inspections, and we discontinued that during the COVID and restarted it last summer. Property code inspections and requirements are being enforced. There's a priority for health and safety. So depending on your issue, There can be different time periods, but the focus is to get a complaint registered. Once it's registered in the system, it has to be followed up on. And it can take some time depending on the workloads, but getting registered is the way to get it addressed.
And I just put both of those links to the code enforcement department and to the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs in the chat. Again, code enforcement for maintenance, broken things, broken appliances, vermin, things that are broken and need fixing after you've contacted the landlord and you feel they're not being responsive. Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs for your rights, for a lease violation, if you feel that something that is promised or required in the lease is not being delivered to you, then the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. And the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs can also just be helpful in counseling you about a situation. And just call and say, I don't think this is right in my lease, or this is what's going on. And they can advise you whether to file a complaint or not, as can the Renters Alliance. So also please get in touch with us if you're not getting the satisfaction you think you're entitled to.
So just to add on to that, we had a question about, I think cockroaches, it might have been mice, but so that was, as Matt just said, code enforcement link is there for pests and vermin. And then, but then earlier we had a question about a 60-day notice to vacate coming at a time, not well before 60 days before the lease term ends. And so that would be the landlord, Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, if you want to, or again, us at the Renters Alliance, or if you've maybe reached out to the property manager, hopefully in writing, to see if there was an error first. But if not, yeah, that would be the Landlord and Tenant Affairs. A question from much earlier oh no, we did address that. So that, okay, so let me see here. Thank you for the note about Tacoma Park, that only being a one-year lease. Let's do, sorry if you said it already, but reminder that Gaithersburg and then Rockville and Tacoma Park in the city limits has their own enforcement of code and landlord and tenant affairs. We had a question about electronic rent payments, and I actually had this question myself a year ago. So if they switch the method that they accept payment to only electronic, are they allowed to do that? That's the question.
What I know about that, Frank, and chime in if I don't get it all, is that first of all, if they can't require you to do it, if they require you to pay for it. So they can't say, look, you've got to do it electronically. And if you do it electronically, you have to pay an extra vig, an extra bit of money for that. So that they can't do. The other is, Frank, I don't believe that it is legal for a landlord to refuse commonly accepted forms of payment like check or money order, because not everybody who lives in an apartment community may have a bank account or may feel comfortable with having electronic or ACH funds transfer. So I don't believe that they can do that. But Frank, what do you think?
I don't know the limitations on forms of payment, but they must accept payment made with legitimate funds. So whether or not they say they won't accept personal checks, will only accept bank checks or certified checks, or they can say they won't take it in cash. So they must offer options. I will have to look that up. And so I don't have a specific answer on what options they need to offer.
But I think the rule of thumb is, you're right, Frank. I mean, any reasonably normally accepted form of payment, except cash, or wheelbarrow full of pennies if you're pissed one day, that would not be helpful either. But by check or money order, and I believe if they accept either one, they have to accept both. And then, of course, I don't know if they have to accept a electronic transfer, if that's your preferred method of doing it. But I do believe they have to accept by check or cash, but we can double check to make sure that's the case.
Yeah, let me add that the landlord that I use, surcharged $3 to use electronic payment. So I reverted back to writing a check, actually writing 2 checks every month and asking for a receipt for both of them. There's another question, Frank, maybe you can answer this. Are all forms of payment of rent eligible for a receipt? In other words, can the tenant ask for a receipt regardless of the form of payment?
So the landlord must produce a rent ledger upon demand and has to acknowledge receipt. Receiving a check doesn't mean that the money's received. The check has to clear. But the landlord is obligated to confirm receipt of funds.
That's right. And they need to do so immediately. Now, what they can do is they say, if you have an electronic transfer and that electronic transfer proves that it has happened, that is, you get a notification that the funds have transferred or some other electronic receipt from or notification from the landlord, they can say that that constitutes a receipt. So one has to be reasonable here. But if you hand them a check or money order, you can ask for a receipt. Now, if they're not accustomed to do that, one thing that some tenants will do is make a photocopy of the check, hand them the real check and ask them to initial that they've received the copy that you have for them. That's another way to create a receipt. We urge you, please do not lose track of this kind of activity. You're in business with your landlord, and if you pay them thousands of dollars a year, you should have proof that you've done so and be able to show that for when and if the landlord loses track of their ledger, which happens more often than you think. And you need to make sure that you have a record that you have paid your rent. One other thing on rent payments that maybe Chris was referring to before, be very clear when you write a check for your rent that whatever the rent is what you're paying. If you hand the landlord a check for $1,650 and you think you're just paying for the rent, but you haven't paid your utilities, the landlord can divide that money the way they choose. If you give them a check that says this is $1,645 for February's rent, then they cannot divide that money and say you're behind in your rent, as we have seen. That is the rent money. They can't separate any other thing that they think you owe them from the rent check, provided the check specifies that this is for this month's rent. On my checks, I say this is the February rent plus parking. That's what I'm paying you for. My water bill, I pay on a separate kind of check. And I advise people to do that because many landlords we have seen will, if you give them one check, they will take off the top what they think you owe in utilities or parking fees or amenities fees, and then say you didn't pay all of your rent, and then charge you a late fee for being late with your rent. So be very clear about what it is you're paying for. David and Frank, what else?
Something I've actually seen when I'm knocking on doors is every once in a while I'll see a sign up that it's clearly a business of sorts is going on here. Someone's selling their personal wares or something. And then we had a question in the chat similar. So what are there laws against using your apartment for personal business? And then this is kind of to the next step. It's that rules where a corporation can pay, rent for where the business is being done, and then that, allowing that the business to pay for the rent. Is this a lease specific thing, or are there rules on this that we can mention?
Frank, I know the answer to this one quick. There's no law preventing it, but it's definitely a lease issue. If your landlord, if you're going to run a business out of your apartment that requires any foot traffic in your apartment, you'd better make sure you have it in writing from your landlord that is permissible. We've seen situations where people are running, childcare services and having 2 or 3 children in the apartment that they take care of while others in the community go to work. People are running hair barber shops in their apartments. Some people are running nightclubs and bars in their apartments. Whatever, that is a lease issue and up to the conduct of renters in your apartment community. However, if there is no foot traffic and no reason for the landlord to have any say of what, I run the renter's allowance out of my apartment. and my staff runs their offices out of their apartments. But there's no foot traffic. We don't have people, we don't have a waiting room. We don't have people coming through. So there's no one coming onto the property other than my using my office space in my apartment for my own work. And that's very common. Lots of people go home, have home offices, and so on. But running a business that interacts with the public and has public traffic coming through would most definitely require the landlord's approval. And I would recommend that you have it in writing. Otherwise, I would recommend that you not put a sign on your door saying open for business. Frank, what do you think?
It's specific to your lease, so you want to be very focused on that.
Right.
Okay, and then I'll just tack on. I'm not an attorney, but it did occur to me that it's a corporation paying the rent. It's a line it seems like might be crossed if you're registering the address of your apartment as that corporation's official address. So I'm just throwing that out there. That might be something to ask about. But I think that's all that I saw.
I want to add one other item, just part of the current environment, the COVID environment, which is the court status. So we talked about responding to court. I think we said it, we want to reinforce it whenever we say court, that if you get a court notice, prepare for it and attend. So even if you don't believe you have any answer, defense, you don't have the money, if you have a court date, it's important to show up. There will be free legal assistance available at the court. There is a state court sponsored legal office that supplies information, can give you very important information, can actually help you file motions. It's called the Help Center, HELP, just Help Center. And they have an attorney on staff and paralegals to help you understand and prepare for your court appearance. There's also going to be free legal representation attorneys available when the court is open and hearing cases in person. The court is currently closed and not hearing cases in person. They are doing them electronically, virtually by Zoom for the tenant holding over. If you've been given a notice that your lease expired and you have to vacate with proper notice that we've mentioned is called tenant holding over, those cases are proceeding electronically or by Zoom or virtual, and any breach of lease cases are being scheduled and being held electronically. And there are attorneys who are available on the Zoom. So the free legal aid, the organization is actually called the HPRP, which stands for Homeless Persons Representation Project. That's just the name. You don't have to be homeless, but they are available on the electronic court dates, and they'll be present when the courts reopen. The failure to pay rent, if your landlord filed against you for not paying rent, the court has not scheduled any of those cases in January or February due to the COVID impact. That is coming off next month. Actually, the first expected date is March the 9th, that they will hold Wednesday failure to pay rent cases in the courthouse in Rockville. So anyone that had a court date in January or February should have received a rescheduling notice. There will be cases heard in March and April. They will be catching up. It will be a slow process to catch up. In the meantime, the court has been issuing the eviction final writs to the sheriff. Sheriffs have been enforcing them in January and February, but since no new judgments were issued in failure to pay rent for 2 months, there will be a backlog, and there'll be some pause in some of those eviction actions over the next couple of months. But I just want to make note that, if people have heard the courts are closed, it has nothing to do with a moratorium. It's no protection against court action. It's simply that the courts determined that in-person court was not safe, and that is changing. And we fully expect it'll be back to catching up on the cases, and they will be held on failure to pay rent fairly full schedule on Wednesdays and Fridays, starting in 2 weeks. So I just want to bring caution to that.
Yeah, and they are going to start moving in earnest in a big way.
Right.
So they have a backlog, but they're also going to, landlords know this too, and they're going to begin filing in earnest for failure to pay rent cases, as Frank pointed out, on March 9th. I want to say that anybody who, if you think that we've given you information that suggests that your rights have been violated, particularly on the issue of rent receipts or your lease, or whether or not the landlord can charge only one method electronically, then contact us and we'll follow up after this meeting. We are just about done, just a few more seconds. We like to end on time. We promise we will. So I want to first thank Deputy Director Frank Demarais from the Housing Department for Montgomery County, covering for multiple staff persons this evening. Thank you for your expertise, Frank. Chris Perry, my Vice Chair of our Renters Alliance Board, David Mullins on my staff, and Pat Beckham on our staff, who are monitoring the chat and will be doing follow-up. We are also going door to door with information for renters, and we have, for those of you who cannot get out to the libraries to collect vaccine tests, vaccine information, tests, COVID tests, and COVID masks, we have a limited number that we can deliver to you. So just email us at info@rentersalliance.org. If you know renters out there who need us to deliver them to them personally, we can also be of assistance to do that. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody. Thank you for coming out. Follow up with us at info@rentersalliance.org, and good night.